Thank you again, all of you guys, for joining us today. Our session today is Survivable Hop Compounds, and I'd like to hand it over to our hosts today, Scott Janish and Spencer Tielkemeier from Yakima Chief Hops. I'm going to pass it on over to you guys and take it away. Spencer, you're on mute.
There we go. Thanks, Nicole. Really appreciate everybody being here. As Nicole said, presentation is exploring the world of survivable compounds, and we're doing this with a esteemed member of the brewing community, someone we're really excited to have on with us today. Scott Janish is co-founder of Sapwood Cellars, brewery specializing in hazy and hop-forward ales and barrel-aged sour beers in Columbia, Maryland. He's also a beer researcher and a blogger at scottjanish.com and the author of The New IPA, a scientific guide to hop, aroma, and flavor. I've actually got my copy right here, I'm proud to say. And it's an extremely compelling book for anybody who doesn't already own it. You should own it very soon. Apart from all that, he is a damn fine individual and a fan of great hops. And we're really pleased to have you on today. Thank you, Scott, for joining us.
No, glad to be on, and thanks for asking me. This will be fun.
Excellent. So my name, as Nicole mentioned, is Spencer Tielkemeier. I'm the East Division Lead and Brewing Innovations Lead for Yakima Chief Hops. I work in both the sales and technical solutions departments, and I'm a former brewer. And I spend most of my time working with brewers across the country on any needs of them, specifically technical needs. Our goal as a Brewing Innovations department is to be able to bring purpose-built solutions to the brewing industry and do the research necessary and put our resources to use to be able to solve problems and make better beer in the market. So with that in mind, we're going to explore a pretty exciting topic, something that's come up over the past year or so within our sort of research agenda. And it's expanded into something that's become quite useful, quite relevant to a lot of brewers within the industry right now. I think it hits upon a lot of the sort of needs and desires of the brewing industry right now, particularly how people are making beer, hoppy beer specifically, obviously. So, so with that, we're going to start this off with a quick presentation on a couple of the concepts that we're working with here, and then we will have a discussion with Scott about how he's utilizing these principles and some other ones in his own brewery and how he's putting some of this to practical use. So with that, I will share my screen. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. As I mentioned, this presentation is called Exploring the World of Survivable Compounds, and we'll get to the definition of what survivable means in a moment, but it's a fascinating group of compounds that I'm lucky to get to explore with everybody today. Just as a quick introduction, for those of you that don't know who we are, I think everybody should mostly know who we are, but we are Yakima Chief Hops, a grower-owned hop company based in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Our mission is very simple, and that is to connect family hop farms with the world's finest brewers, which is, of course, all of you. We are, as I mentioned, 100% grower-owned, so our company is owned by 15 family farms, the folks that you see on your screen there. A lot of familiar faces for those of you who have been to Yakima before, and for those of you that haven't, we would love to host you at any time to meet these lovely folks. That is our mission, to connect you with family hop farms. So, in addition to being a hop grower and a hop merchant and processor, we are also a hop breeder. So our breeding arm is called Yakima Chief Ranches, formerly known as Select Botanicals Group. Yakima Chief Ranches is responsible for the breeding of new hop varieties from initial pollination cross to eventual commercialization. And they are also responsible for farm quality management on those varieties that they breed, so that the Simcoe Citra Mosaic that you know and love is the same Citra Simcoe Mosaic every time that you get it, and quality consistency are second to none. So over the years, Yakima Chief Ranches has been responsible for bringing a number of iconic varieties to market, starting in 1997 with Atanum, and all the way up to current days. Last year releasing Sabro and Pato, and as recently as about 2 weeks ago, releasing a new variety, Talus, formerly known as HBC 692, a very exciting new aroma variety that's got all of us very stoked. So a lot of heavy hitters on there, most of which should be pretty familiar to a lot of brewers today. So with that introduction, let's jump in. This presentation, as I mentioned, is not meant to be exhaustive. It's more meant to be an introduction, sort of a primer on the topics at hand. If anybody would like to take a deeper dive on the topics here, we have recorded very deep dive seminars on these topics in the past and would be happy to send you those links. You can either email the Hop and Brew School website or myself or the Brewing Help Desk at the end of this presentation for a link to those recorded presentations. But in this case, we're going to take a high-level look at survivable compounds, where it came from, where this research was born, what it was born out of, and where we intend to go with it in the future. So an interesting way to start, I think, is to take a conventional look at a sort of a hop metric, an analytical hop metric. As many of you know, the traditional certificate of analysis contains a pretty standard array of compounds, mostly alpha, beta, HSI, total oil, and usually a list of select sesquiterpenes, monoterpenes, and monoterpene alcohols. A lot of brewers over the years have paid a lot of attention to total oil as a potential metric. It's long been our position that total oil is a metric, but is definitely not a uniquely purpose-built indicator of hop aroma intensity. It would be nice if it was, but unfortunately it's not. It does have some indication of overall intensity, but it's not a perfect indicator. And to kind of illustrate that and illustrate sort of where some of our research was born out of, we'll take a look at total oil as a metric. And we're going to pick on Sorachi Ace here just because it happens to reside at the very, very top of the varietal averages spectrum for total oil content over the past 3 harvest years. So Sorachi Ace has 4.2 milliliters per 100 grams of hops, which is the highest of any hop that we regularly produce. Very high total aroma, or very high total oil content. However, when we take a deeper dive, we look at the terpene group here, myrcene, caryophyllene, and humulene. We notice that Sorachi Ace is relatively high in this. However, this is not a group that we're particularly super interested in when it comes to making modern aromatic beers. In general, it's agreed upon that these compounds are very hydrophobic, do not want to survive the brewing process. They are generally not going to make it into finished beer, and are generally not, at least in conventional wisdom, going to make a huge impact in the aroma and flavor of a product. So probably not as impactful that it's higher up on that list. Now, when we get into a little bit more important territory, the monoterpene alcohols, the 2 most common of which are geraniol and linalool, we notice that Sorachi Ace is quite low in those compounds. So even though that total oil is quite high, the corresponding contents of geraniol and linalool are quite low. And this is important because geraniol and linalool are very commonly surviving into finished beers, and therefore are thought to make a significant impact in the flavor and aroma of finished beers. Moving on, we look at the ester group. This is a much larger group. We do see a vast amount of esters in hops, not as many of them actually surviving into beer. But once again, we see that Sorachi Ace is actually not going to correspondingly match its total oil content with its aromatic potential. We notice that the ester content is extremely, extremely low. As compared to some other more heavy hitter varieties on the ester front. It's worth noting that not all of these compounds, not all of these esters are going to survive into beer, but they are in some ways aromatic indicators. And so we see again that, that it's not necessarily meshing up with the total oil content. And then finally, looking at the sulfur group, we are looking at both thioesters and thioates, thioesters and polyfunctional thiols. on this slide, and we notice that srirachiase is kind of right in the middle of the pack. And one of the things that it's higher in is methyl thiohexanoate, which is not thought to be as desirable. So that's a lot of information all at once. You don't have to know and understand every single compound that I just mentioned in order to kind of take away the broad strokes, the broad strokes picture here. What this is meant to show is that total oil does not necessarily correspond with aromatic intensity. Total oil is made up of a lot of things, some of which are not aromatic in nature. So the reason why we kind of set out on the sort of survivables research that we're going to talk about today is sort of born out of the idea that we wanted to go beyond the traditional certificate of analysis to look at how hop compounds that we can track, that we can detect, are potentially making a larger impact into beer and potentially provide better tools to brewers to be able to predict predict hop aroma and make better beer. So taking a look specifically at a relatively new group of components, I'm just going to give a quick introduction to sulfur components. And Scott, I know this is a particularly interesting group of components for you that gets mentioned in your book and gets mentioned in your blog quite often. Do you see quite a bit of excitement among other brewers with this group of compounds?
Yeah, the sulfurs, when we're talking about thiols, I think it's kind of a fascination for us because it's a relatively new compound that people are talking about, or compounds. Before, I would think in the last, the wine world has been looking at these closely for some time, and I think as brewers are starting to get a little more comfortable with the the three main ones, I think, that are often talked about, the 3MH, 3MHA, and 4MMP. So now it's just trying to figure out what's the best way to get these compounds into beer, and which ones stay, and how do the process variables impact them. And so that's why I'm excited about the research you guys are doing on survivables.
Yeah, well said. Couldn't have put it better myself. I think they're just they're an extremely exciting group of compounds, specifically because they seem to have so much promise aromatically speaking, but also they're relatively new. There's not a lot of, as you mentioned, historical study of these compounds, in the beer world that's been pretty much isolated to wine by and large. Probably not until maybe 10, 12 years ago were people really putting significant time and effort into researching these in beer. At least not where it was on everybody's radar. And so anyway, a quick look at them from a group standpoint. There are three main types of sulfur-bearing compounds that we do measure for and are of current relevance: sulfides, thioesters, and polyfunctional thiols. The third group, as Scott mentioned, is the one that's of primary interest to us. They do require rather specialized equipment to detect, which is one of the reasons why they've not been widely studied prior to this. There's actually only a handful of labs in the world that are capable of detecting these because they are in such minute quantities in hops. For those that are interested, they are detected via an add-on to the current gas chromatogram process via sulfur chemiluminescence detector, or SCD. Basically, it's a sulfur detector that's an add-on to the current GC process. And YCH now analyzes lots for thioesters and polyfunctional thiols, starting with last year's harvest and continuing on into the future. So, not going to get too deep into sulfides sulfides and thioesters today. Like I said, with limited time here, I'd rather just spend some time on polyfunctional thiols. But as I mentioned, for those of you that are interested, we have recorded presentations before that that dive deep into the implications of those two groups. But polyfunctional thiols is probably the most exciting group of compounds within the subgroup of sort of the sulfur-bearing heading. And that's because they seem to have the potential to deliver so much in such small quantities and so much good in such small quantities. It's only potentially useful if it's delivering good things, or maybe not only, but that's what's going to primarily motivate us from a beer standpoint. So these are in very low concentrations in hops, so something on the order of parts per billion. But the human nose can detect them at an extremely low threshold, so more like parts per trillion. And that's one of the things that makes these so compelling, is that even though they are very difficult to detect, they're in very, very minute quantities in hops. They are, pardon me, my screen went blank. Sorry about that. They are interesting because they do deliver so much impact at a relatively low level compared to other compounds. So generally considered to contribute a pleasant aroma, contained in tropical fruits, which is kind of a ding, ding, ding right there. That is something that we'd like to be interested in. And they can be bound to amino acids and thought to potentially be released by yeast enzymes such as beta lyase during the fermentation process. So as Scott mentioned, there are a couple that are really three that are that have brewers really excited right now. Those are 3-MH and 3-MHA, 3-mercaptahexanol, sometimes called 3-sulfanyl-hexanol, depending on which nomenclature you use, same compound. It's contained in both hops and malts. It has a grapefruit and sometimes blackcurrant aroma. And very interestingly, it actually increases during wort boil, which is a very unique phenomenon. We don't see many compounds in hops that actually increase during wort boil. So there's really some interest in how to maximize that for maximum benefit. There's a related compound called 3-mercaptahexylacetate, which is not found in hops. And this is found in beer via what's thought to be the yeast biotransformation of 3-MH. So essentially, 3-MH is thought to be the raw material to produce 3-MHA. And what makes it most interesting is that it does have, at very low thresholds, seems to have a very intense grapefruit and passion fruit aroma. And that's particularly intriguing because you'd be pretty hard pressed at this point to find many brewers who aren't interested in getting more grapefruit and passion fruit aroma into their beer. So naturally, it's something we'd like to pay close attention to. So YCH is testing 3-MH on all lots for crop year 19 and forward, which is very exciting because it gives us a lot of background on what, where and when and how 3-MH is showing up in hops. I'm not going to get into Forum MP today. That's one that Scott mentioned. It's also a pretty interesting compound. It doesn't show up as readily in standard analysis. It makes it much more difficult to measure. We have the capability of measuring it, but at this point, it's not something that we measure all the time because of its difficulty. So once again, if you want to look at that, that's covered in more detail in our previous presentations. So why care about this stuff? Why do the sulfur compounds matter? Why go down this path? There's a number of reasons to care. Thiols, from a synergistic perspective, thiols have been thought to potentially be able to enhance the intensity of monoterpene alcohols. So linalool and geraniol, which are already aromatic compounds. Thiols are thought to potentially be able to boost the character of those compounds. And potential use as blend components. If we have a hop that's extremely high in 3-MH and another hop that's extremely high in linalool and geraniol, we know that those two could potentially come together to form something that's sort of greater than the sum of the parts. And that's what I mean when I say flavor pop technology, and I have the guy with the MSG on the side. That's sort of meant to be a joke, but it's also, kind of indicative of sort of what we're looking for here, which is a way to make flavors pop beyond what we could do with individual hops on their own, right? How do we use thiols to their maximum benefit? And then, by that same token, on the breeding side, measuring 3-MH, studying 3-MH and other compounds like it can help us make better decisions on the breeding side, basically helping us establish certain cultivars that might show promise based on analytical analysis that we wouldn't be able to see, or we wouldn't have seen in previous years. So pretty exciting. I think there's a ton of applications for this in modern brewing, and we're kind of just at the tip of the iceberg right now. So to get to the topic at hand here, Survivables is essentially a group of compounds that we began kind of toying around with and sort of grouping together when we were looking at data. And the common thread between them is that they commonly show up in finished beer. So when we analyze finished beer, we very commonly see these 7 compounds showing up in beer. which is where we got the name Survivables from. That's sort of the genesis of it, is that they survive the brewing process. They survive heat, they survive alcohol exposure, they survive CO2 exposure, fermentation. And that's unique among compounds, because the vast majority of hop compounds do not survive, at least in their original format, into finished beer. So paying attention to the things that do is a way for us to kind of work backwards to establish what is in hops that we need to pay attention to. There's over 1,000 different compounds in hops, so much easier to start with 7 and work backwards rather than starting with 1,000 and working forwards at times. So what you'll see on this list is a mix of compounds, a few esters, methylduranate, 2-nonanone, butanoic acid, 3-methylbutyl ester, 2-methylbutyl isobutyrate, and then 2 monoterpene alcohols, linalool and geraniol, and then also 3-MH, which is the thiol that we mentioned a moment ago. So you'll notice the graph shows different American cultivars that are measured as a sort of an aggregate of their total quantity of survivable compounds. And it's really interesting to look at. There's just a ton to unpack, from this graph, because of all the variety among the different cultivars. I think I would, caution people from reading too much into this graph right off the bat. What we see is that, something like Idaho 7 up at the top is really just chock full of things that survive the brewing process. And what this tells us is that not necessarily that Idaho 7 is a better hop than these other hops on the list. For example, Azacca down at the bottom. We know that Azacca is an incredible hop. People use it all the time with great success. What we do potentially, realize, though, is that maybe Idaho 7 is actually a better whirlpool hop than Azacca is, and Azacca may be a better post-firm dry hop than a whirlpool hop, because of the fact that it doesn't have compounds that readily survive heating and fermentation as well. So a number of different ways you can look at it, but I would say on the whole, some of the theories we've been testing out is, hops that higher up on the list using them earlier in the brewing process, and hops lower on the list using them later in the brewing process. And Scott, this is something that you've blogged pretty extensively about, and you've put a lot of these theories to the test in your own brewery at Sapwood. Do you I talk about this graph a little bit and how it speaks to you, and what you've observed as you've kind of tested some of these theories, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, this was when you guys first shared this graph, I thought it was one of the more exciting graphs in terms of hop research in a while, because to me it's useful. Just as you were just explaining that, there's 1,000+ compounds in hops, which can be a little overwhelming to really sit down and think about, when you're putting together a recipe, like which ones should I care about? But here it's great, because it's like, oh, okay, we know these compounds are in the finished beer, so let's focus in on those. And for us at the brewery, like hop saturated flavor, which we think really just comes from the hop side mainly, is really difficult to obtain. I think if you taste a lot of your beers after fermentation, you'll notice that it's just kind of a generic beer flavor. There's not a lot of hop intensity there for the most part. And so here at Sapwood, we're speaking for myself, I'm kind of obsessed with tasting our beers right before we dry hop and taking notes, and say how much hop aromatic, how much hop flavor am I getting from this beer? How much hop aroma am I getting from this beer? Just to see if the process we did, the hop varieties we chose for the whirlpool, are making a difference, or maybe that we tried different amounts or different temperatures, dropping the whirlpool a little bit. And so when I saw this chart, that it actually sort of helped us understand our results a little better, because we were already seeing some of those on the varieties that were kind of towards the left of this chart, really having a greater impact in some of our beers. So it's great for using some varieties that maybe you thought didn't have a use in your brewery anymore. It's easy to just get stuck using the same sexier varieties, but for us, hop saturated flavor is such a huge component of a great IPA, and so we're constantly trying to achieve that. And so this has been helpful to point us in a direction of which varieties to choose and maybe when to even use them.
Yeah, it's like I said, I'm a former brewer myself. So once we kind of started going down this road, it was kind of eye-opening to think about the potential implications. Because, as I mentioned before, there's very little on the traditional C of A that was actually intended for brewers to use originally, right? We use the certificate of analysis as if it was meant for brewers in a lot of ways, but really it was kind of originally designed for varietal purity comparison purposes, you know, a way for labs to measure, you know, differences between cultivars, and also to be able to establish whether what they were looking at was actually Cascade or actually Citra, or, you know, to establish varietal purity in a sample. It's not as useful, you know, for brewers as it could be. You know, it's potentially, at least, and that's our thought right now. At least we, you know, when we're looking at these things, like you said, Scott, you know, when I was a brewer, it was always very difficult to get beers prior to dry hop to be anything more than what you basically described, kind of a generically fruity, pretty hoppy, but, you know, sort of you know, vanilla wort stream that was then going to be the canvas for dry hopping and stuff like that, where you get your main portion of hop you know, expression. But the thought is now, you know, and some of your experiments have pointed to this, that potentially by using the right hops, we actually could make a much greater impact in those situations, you know, where it is hard to get stuff to survive. And I love what you said too about, you know, some of the commonly overlooked varieties, some of the underutilized varieties, unsung heroes of the hop world, like Crystal, Mount Hood, you know, Laurel, I think, is underutilized. Warrior, Nugget, Liberty, things like that, that are pretty packed with certain things that really can make an impact in beer, but often get overlooked because they maybe are not as, they don't pop off of the table in raw hop analysis as much as others do. So, so anyway, yeah, I think this, you know, really, I think this graph is sort of the tip of the iceberg here, but there's just a lot to unpack from it and a lot to test out. And it's got us really excited about sort of just the future of what we can do with stuff like this. Do you have any standouts, you know, from your experimentation with it so far? I know Idaho 7 was kind of a highlight variety for you in a recent blog post.
Yeah, in fact, that was, you know, I think it was like last year around this time, I was kind of obsessed with Idaho 7 because I couldn't believe how much hop flavor it was giving to our beers. And in fact, sometimes we were even having to back down on the amounts we were using in the whirlpool because it was getting in the way of certain dry hops, because it was just that dominant, which is very, very rare in our experience for, you know, whirlpool hops to have an impact like that. I mean, a lot of times we're using our whirlpool hops thinking more of, you know, we're trying to balance, we're just trying to push a bunch of compounds into the fermenter, but we're also just kind of choosing the varieties based on, you know, alpha to make sure we're hitting our bittering targets too. And Idaho 7 was just one that just really stood out. But not to just go right down the list, but Mosaic has always been one of those for us too that we felt was a strong player in getting that hop saturated flavor. And because, like I said, like there's a handful of varieties that we would use, and you're like, I can't even tell it's in there. And so, I mean, we started, you know, we sort of dubbed some of the hops, you know, cheater hops, which we call are like the, you know, the Citra galaxies that, you know, you should make good beer with them, right? Because they're just so great. And then we sort of joked that, you know, a lot of these cheaper hops, you know, not the cheaper ones like, you know, Columbus or something, were good in the whirlpool, and that was one we also have had a lot of good luck with. But yeah, Idaho 7 by far has been the standout for hop side.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I'm extremely bullish on that variety too. We've started growing a lot more of it. Started growing some of it in Washington. We've got, you know, some of our you know, our oldest and longest standing growers growing it. So it's a really exciting variety, yields really well. It's got a lot of the makings of a great hop, both from a brewer and grower standpoint. So really exciting. And You know, one thing I'll point out too is this is really not an exhaustive list. You know, what we know is that we don't know everything. And things like Citra, you see are, you know, 5th down on the list. You mentioned Columbus. That's actually not on this list because the alpha hops tend to have a few other things in them that really kind of skew the way that this graph shows up. So the traditional alpha hops like Pato, CTZ, things like that are not actually on this list. But there is some potential great aroma impact in using a really high aromatic quality lot of Columbus. So anyway, not to spend too much time on that, but I just think there's so much that we can do with that moving forward. And it's, like I say, just cracking the surface. So as we did, you know, as we started going down this path, we did want to kind of, you know, the first thing that came to mind, you know, as a brewer is like, okay, well, I want to put this to use, right? Let's make a beer. Let's figure out how we can utilize this in beer. So we decided to kind of just take a stab at putting these theories to use and creating a blend surrounding this. And so the blend we produced in 2019 called Tri-2304CR. It is a cryo blend, and it's specifically designed, just using the graph that we just looked at, to essentially create a supercharged blend of survivables. That's really, if you want to simplify it very much, that's kind of where it came from. Designed to maximize beer-soluble compounds in a hop blend. Blended to be able to load the Whirlpool and early dry hop with survivables, high in geraniol, linalool, 3-MH, methyl duranate. And once again, targeting synergies between components. At the end of the day, flavor pop, that's what we were looking for and trying to establish in the creation of this blend. So a really exciting project. It was, you know, like I say, just kind of a first go at trying to utilize this research into something practical, something useful. And taking a look back at the graph itself, you'll notice that on the first go, we did really well. It sits at the top of the list there. You'll notice, like I said, high in linalool, really well balanced too. That's the other thing. You'll see that it looks a lot like the IDO 7 profile, but even sort of extended, bigger. So, you know, we learned a lot too. A couple compounds didn't concentrate as readily as we thought they would. A couple others did concentrate a little more than we thought they would. So some really key learnings there. But overall, we've had great success with this blend. We've gotten it out to some brewers who have had a chance to use it. Small plug for some friends in Canada. I'm actually drinking a Tri-2304CR beer right now, made by Mesorim in Bas Canada and Yakima Chief in Quebec. So shout out to you guys and Luke up in Canada for putting out some good beer. It is excellent. And what we found is that, you know, by and large, it's done what we thought it would. It does seem to increase the synergies between components. It does seem to make beers pop, both in using it as a single hop situation and also in some cases using it almost like you would use a salt when cooking. So blending in, you know, 20 to 40% of this blend to try to amplify the varieties that you more commonly use. So to maybe get a new expression on Citra, a new expression on Mosaic, something like that. So it's been very, very exciting, very useful so far. And it's something we're going to produce again and continue to refine into the future. So pretty fun project and something we've been really excited about. And to kind of take a look at, you know, sort of a trial examination of the blend itself. So this is kind of fun, I think, to look at, and one of the things that I think makes brewers crazy and makes them pull their hair out all the time, and Scott, you could probably speak to this too, is the difference between what a hop smells like on the table to what it actually presents itself being in beer, right? Certain hops we know just kind of pop off the table when you're rubbing them, when you're smelling them in raw hop form, more than they do in beer. And then other hops which don't present themselves that well sometimes just are outrageously aromatic in beer. So what we hope to do, you know, little by little is kind of connect the dots between those two concepts to be able to help brewers make better decisions surrounding their hop usage. So this kind of shows off a little bit of that right now. So this is the raw hop analysis of the Tri-2304CR blend when we first created it. So our sensory team analyzed it. Shout out to Tommy, Tessa, and Tiffany for putting this report together. And what you'll notice is that it's not, I mean, it looks nice, but it doesn't look like insanely compelling right off the bat, right? Lemon, lemongrass, cantaloupe, dill, pine, resinous. So you know, in some ways, the raw hop analysis is not something that would necessarily make you run to your hop supplier immediately and say, I need some. But we do notice that the results get way more interesting when we actually deploy this blend in beer. So what we did was produce 3 beers, all of them with the same exact hop blend, the Tri-2304 blend, but 3 different conditions, 1 whirlpool only, 1 whirlpool and active fermentation dry hop, and 1 whirlpool and post-ferm dry hop. Same recipe all the way through. And what we notice is that there are some major differences in the way that this blend expresses depending on where it's used. And this is really compelling, and really what we hope to see was that the survivables are sort of being utilized in different ways depending on where they're used in the process, right? So what was extremely compelling too was that we noticed that the active firm dry hop in this case was pretty much unanimously preferred by the panel, and shows a higher citrus and floral spike that wasn't really present in the post-fermentation dry hop. Now, it should be noted that everybody really liked the post-fermentation dry hop beer as well. I actually tasted it myself and thought it was also an excellent beer. It was just different, and we felt like the expression that was produced in the active fermentation situation was particularly compelling. And our hunch would be that there is biotransformative activity going on to create certain flavors that were not present in a raw hop analysis, and were not present in the post-fermentation dry hop situation. So before I move on, Scott, you brew tons and tons of experimental beers. What's your feeling on biotransformation? Do you believe that yeast is interacting with hops in meaningful ways? Do you think it's all just a wives' tale or something like that? You know, everybody has differing opinions on it. I believe in it. I think there's a lot that we need to learn about it, but I believe in it. What do you think about it?
I think I also believe in it. And I'm fascinated by the research that's been done into it, and I think there's hopefully going to be a lot more to come. And there's been a few studies, I mean, just recently that shows, maybe it's not as big of a component as we think. But then there's also other papers that show a different story. In terms of, like, I think when people think of biotransformation, they think of the biotransformation active firm dry hop addition, right? I think that's what most people associate with that. I think there's a lot to be said about, what enzymes certain yeasts are producing during fermentation, and what you can even expect from a biotransformative impact from fermentation. But more than just what compounds may be, freed or transformed, I think active firm dry hopping in many ways can be a component of your recipe, not really on biotransformation, but what it does to the compounds in those hops in terms of, which compounds are being, some of the hydrocarbons, the ones that are usually a little bit more volatile and blow off easier. If you're dry hopping mid-firm, you're probably going to lose a lot of those, and hopefully leave behind some more of those more polar, fruitier, like monoterpene alcohols. And so in a lot of ways, I think, I'm not sure if, how much of the actual biotransformation is happening with those mid-firm dry hops, but for us, we look at it more as a way to change how those hop varieties interact with the beer. I mean, you can get just like you saw with your blend here, you got more of a citrus floral thing, and it looks like the actual post-firm one was a little more, herbal and slightly more woody. And I know when we were talking a week ago, we were discussing Sabro as one of these hops too, that completely changes, I think, when you do it mid-firm or post-firm. And in a way, it's a way to kind of tone down a hop or certain components of a hop by using fermentation as a method of getting rid of certain compounds. Like I'm fascinated with the idea of like wet dry hopping, like wet hops, but it's to me a kind of a grassier, grassier kind of sensation. And I always wonder about, maybe, wet hopping day 1, day 2 beers, and see how that changes. So there's biotransformation happening, but there's also, I think you might be blowing off some compounds that are masking other ones. Some a lot of these hydrocarbons are the majority of a hop oil. And so if you're blowing a lot of those off, you might actually be, allowing other ones to shine. So I believe in biotransformation. I just kegged a beer the other day where I put an enzyme directly into the beer to experiment with it. But so I won't give up on it. I'll keep trying it.
I think you nailed it, and I think you basically hit what would be my belief in it is, speaking in extremely broad strokes. I think they're active from dry hopping has the potential to amplify the good and diminish the bad in some situations, and we see that very commonly happening. And I think so when people talk about biotransformation, it's like, I think there are things happening for sure. I think there's probably, like you said, enzymatic activity that is converting one thing into another, potentially like increasing synergies, and there's all these other things. We may also overblow that in some ways in terms of its significance. The thing about it is there's so much to research regarding it that we're a long way from knowing it like the back of our hand. Hops have enough variables in them without involving another, huge set of variables, which is yeast and how it performs in the different fermentation parameters and all that other stuff. However, I think people diminish sometimes what the potential that exists of sort of like an addition by subtraction, right? The terpene group that you mentioned, myrcene, humulene, farnesene, those are, rather woody, and in most cases, kind of a little bit like carrot-like in myrcene's case. They're not necessarily like super pleasant on their own. When you smell an isolate of those hops, of those compounds, they're pretty weird. And I'm not saying that they're wholly unpleasant. They do have, a character when they're blended together that kind of is like sort of a general hoppiness in beer. But it's possible because they are in such large quantities in hops that, like you said, they're masking things that we'd rather show through. So by active from dry hopping, we could potentially diminish those spikes and increase the perception of others that we want to shine more brightly. So Sabro is a great example, like you said. Sabro has kind of a characteristic of that Neo-Mexicanus family is sort of like a bright, like fresh cut cedar woody character sometimes. And I think that diminishes substantially when it's used in an active firm dry hop situation. And what results is this big, creamy daiquiri, pineapple, berries, and all kinds of other sort of like beautiful tropical fruit that I think really shine most brightly in that active firm dry hop situation. So, so that's kind of the crux of what we're going for here is like, how do we, rather than just like release a variety out in the market, how do we release a variety and say, this is what it was intended for? Or this is where we think it shines best, because of its makeup, its analytics, things like that, and sort of the sky's the limit with that, really. So yeah, it's very exciting. Drawing that to a close. What you'll see here is just a comparison between that original raw hop analysis and then the active firm dry hop analysis of the beer itself. So you'll see that the common minor descriptors went from lemon, lemongrass, cantaloupe, etc., to grapefruit, orange, mango, peach, rose, guava, which is like a whole different set of descriptors that I think brewers would be significantly more excited about if we told them that a blend was going to yield those flavors, right? So there's just, there's a lot, as you mentioned, a lot that we don't know, a lot that we need to study more, but this is, I think, a major step in the right direction for, at least for our purposes, So where do we go from here? I think, like I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Some of the things that we're looking at right now is levels of detectable esters. This is a huge group of compounds. There's many different ones. We see, I think what's really interesting about esters is the tremendous variety that you see between cultivars. So, I mean, if you're looking at this list, it's a vast amount of variance, between the cultivars that we're looking at. Not all of these esters are going to prove to be important in the end. Some of them are not going to survive into beer. Some of them maybe have an effect on beer earlier on, but don't survive in their finished format. Anyway, there's a lot of reasons to be interested in esters. That's one of the groups that we're studying now to kind of refine where we go from here and potentially refine things like blends in our analysis of breeding programs and things like that. So that's kind of where I see us going in the immediate future. And then from there, I think, we'd like to get brewers talking in terms of survivables. We'd like to get them talking about linalool content in their hops, 3MH content in their hops. We'd like to even get to the point potentially down the road where we feel confident enough in these analyses that we can maybe even revamp the current C of A and add additional pieces of information to it so that brewers are better informed when they're making decisions about what hop to use when and in what recipe as they're designing recipes. So just a lot to unpack as we go along. But that's enough for the slides. Let's get to speaking a little bit more with Scott. We're going to talk to Scott about some of his experience with some of these things. As I mentioned, Scott is the author of the new IPA. If you don't have his book, I highly recommend that you purchase it from scottjanish.com. It's a very, very thorough look at a lot of the concepts that we've discussed here, and it's and much more. It's a very, very hefty read, packed with tons of information. So very, very good book. And before we take it off of the screen, I will just offer these two email addresses. We have a brewing help desk called brewinghelp@yakimachief.com, which is staffed by myself and about 6 others, all of whom are former brewers, people who work in our technical solutions department and have the kind of express purpose of being able to help you guys with any problem that you come up with, really. That's what we're there for, is to get you a quick response, to offer advice, to help you work through any situations that you encounter. And also my email address is also available there for anybody who'd like to email me directly. And with that, I'll stop sharing the screen and we'll talk to Scott a little bit more here. Scott, some of the thing that I think that comes from this is just how quickly we disprove what we previously know. I don't know if you felt that way when you were writing the new IPAs. Like every time you read a paper, you read another paper that was ready to disprove it, you know, or not disprove it, but expand upon it or change the way you thought about it. It's like we're advancing quite rapidly in the world of hop research. I think that like every day, I think what we did yesterday almost feels dated sometimes. Did you get that feeling when you were writing the book? And do you still read journals all the time? Do you feel like we're going to have like a new IPA at some point because it's updated, you know? How does that go in your current life, you know?
Yeah, it was interesting writing a book that was mainly focused on, you know, hazy IPAs when there was only maybe 2 studies at that point that focused on exactly that, a hazy IPA. You know, almost all the research, you know, as of a couple of years ago was you know, focusing, you could almost see it. It like started with like the myrcene levels was like how the compound that they would use for like determining hop flavor, and then it sort of moved on to linalool and geraniol, and then more recently it's being, you know, looked at more of the polyfunctional thiols and now hop drive esters and even hop drive acids. So it's kind of cool to see that progression. But yeah, I definitely still am, you know, love reading journals and look forward to every time there's a new crop of papers that come out. Because, you know, here at the brewery, we use those for, you know, not only trying to figure out or understand why our beers are the way they are, but they're so great at helping us come up with experiments, you know, testing, you know, using the research to, you know, test the process, you know, test different hops at different times and change up your ingredients. And so that's one of my favorite parts of, you know, for example, I have a weird IPL fermenting right now, and I mainly was interested to do it because of, I know one paper suggested that, you know, the cooler temperatures that you're dry hopping or fermenting a lot of these beers, you might retain more of these styles, you know, almost like a hot, warm ferment almost, you know, pushes more of the aromatics out, whereas, you know, a calmer kind of extended cold ferment might help. And so, you know, I'm trying to do, you know, experiment with a cold ferment and, you know, active enzymes in there and, you know, early dry hops and heavy whirlpools. And that's what the research, that's why I'm so excited about research, is because it pushes new ideas. You know, and that's not the reason that the researchers were putting together that particular study, but it's kind of like I read that and like, oh, you know what would be cool is to use that in this way. And so, yeah, I'm still always reading them, and it probably won't be a new IPA out anytime soon. took a long time to do that one, but I keep writing blog posts when I experiment with stuff. So I'll stick with that. It's easier to publish a post than it is to publish a book.
Yeah, dude, there's a lot of writing in there. I mean, I can't imagine how, apart from running a brewery and everything like that, you had time to write a book and stuff like that, but we're grateful for it. So, yeah, it's, you know, it is fascinating, and I try to read them as often as I can myself. I think I read the Takoi one, I believe, that you're referencing with the, you know, the lager yeast, or maybe it's a different one, but there's some really, really good research out there, and I would encourage everybody on the, you know, who's listening to seek out some of the ASBC or MBAA white papers that get published regularly. A lot of them are quite dense, but I'm not a chemist, and it's not my background. But you know, if you love beer and you work in beer and you know that's part of your passion, I think they're all relatively easy enough to dive into for even non-chemists, and I would encourage everybody to kind of give them a read every now and then. It's really great. So. I'm going to ask you one more question here before we open it up for Q&A, Scott. From a brewer's perspective, you know, what would you most like to see in the hop world in the next 5 years? You know, new products, more varieties, better research. You know, what do you think that for you and for the beer world, what does the world demand right now of us, of the hop world in general? Like, what do you see as the future?
You know, it's always exciting to have like new products, new varieties, you know, the new cryos of the world, or the new extracts, or the pick your number of an experimental variety hop. It's exciting, but I think it's equally as exciting to understand how to use the hops we already have a little better. And that's, you know, whether it's, you know, more research into, you know, like the survivable research, or you know, yeast interaction is a big one that I think is starting to get looked at. I love the, you know, papers that'll test 10 different yeast strains on a hoppy beer, and they look at, you know, what impact did it have on the compounds in that beer. You know, like I was saying earlier, like a cooler ferment, for example. There was a recent one that tested hop drive esters after, you know, fermenting with different strains, and found that, you know, some of the dry strains that you wouldn't think to use necessarily were leaving a lot of the like 2-MID, which is a big ester that's kind of apricot leaning. And you know, and whether or not that's, you know, it's leaving behind those more, or, you know, maybe something else is being converted. You know, it's not really sure, but I in the future just love to see us understand better the hops we have now, how we can maximize certain compounds or certain flavors, and you know, just a better way to really dial in a recipe to get exactly what you want, and then understand the results, you know, rather than just throwing, you know, hops in and go, I know if I do this, it's going to turn out like this. But, you know, more of an intentional use of hops at certain times is something that I would love to see, because it's, you know, it's hard to even keep track of all the new experimental varieties at this point. And, you know, and a lot of times as brewers, you're hesitant to use them at like a brewery, because you might not be able to really you'll get enough to do a small test batch or something, but you can't, you know, if it hits and people love it, you might not be able to get a bunch of it right away. And so those kind of just take their time to hit the market in volume enough to use. But so for me in the future, I'd love to see just a better understanding of kind of the hops we have now, and how to really purposefully use them to get results we're after.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, from our perspective, you know, it's like we love breeding new hops. It's like at the core of what we do. Our breeding program has, you know, been sort of like the heartbeat of just our whole organization for a long time. And that kind of shows in the hops that we regularly grow and ones that we're passionate about and stuff like that. So we love bringing new varieties to market. We love having experimental, you know, hops that people can try and all that stuff. By the same token, though, it's like there's a lot of, you know, hops that people that growers have acreage in that they really love growing. It yields well for them. It fits in their pick window. It's like, you know, there's all these reasons why it's compelling for the supply chain as a whole, for the whole industry keep them around, right? If we have a use for them. And I think that's one of the things that I love about this is it potentially uncovers uses for hops that maybe have been overlooked for a while that fit really well into our industry as a whole. A lot of time and energy and dollars and things like that have been invested in putting, you know, like I said, Crystal, Mount Hood, you know, some of those varieties like that into the ground and maintaining them and having bred them in the first place. So it just adds value to brewers and growers alike if we can find better uses for those hops to where they, you know, they have a longer lifespan and we don't have to always replace with something new. So it's a balance of the two. And I think the other fascinating thing too is like, if we know more about how hops express, if we know more about what they do, it just makes our breeding program that much better because we can say, you know, ahead of time, like this is what we're going for when we bred this hop. We were deliberately trying to breed a high 3MH hop or a, you know, like just a high survivables hop or something like that. You know, it's like we have a framework by which we can really dial in because a hop breeding schema takes 10 years, you know, from pollen cross to commercialization. So the more we can inform that decision making along the way, the better off, you know, everybody is, the supply, you know, brewers and growers. So
yeah, I like how you said that, you know, like 3MH, hops high in 3MH, and that's one of the interesting things for me is like bittering additions is something most people don't think has use whatever hop you have on hand because it's not going to make a difference. Well, you know, it turns out it probably can have an impact flavor wise. You know, you're losing a lot of compounds, true. But knowing that 3MH might actually increase in the boil and have more of a grapefruit forward kind of thing, it's interesting to think, you know, I think Millennium was high on that list for 3MH. Might be an excellent 60-minute addition, you know, or your 30 or, you know, our first wort. So that's the kind of stuff I get excited about too, is a lot of these hops that we overlook or don't use might have like a great purpose in a beer. It's just you got to figure out the best way to massage them into the recipe.
yeah, well said. Yeah, Pato, Columbus, a few of those others are extremely high in 3MH, and so there's reason to believe that, you know, because they concentrate in wort boil, that they could make a huge impact just by being a bittering addition potentially. So, but all right, well, we're almost at an hour here, so I want to be sure to leave some time for Q&A among the people that are online here. We've got 2 questions so far. Thoughts on active firm and post firm dry hopping with the same hop in a single beer. Does it negate the addition by subtraction benefits? What do you think about that, Scott? I think I have my thoughts on it, but
I think that if you did a side by side, you know, I haven't actually done that. That's actually an interesting question and interesting experiment to try. But I think if you did like take Citra and you did an active firm and then a post firm, I think you would get a different beer in the end than you would, you know, just doing one or the other. It's an interesting thought. I think like Citra, for example, you probably lose a lot of the greener compounds if you're doing that post firm. But if you're going to dry hop, you're going to then you're going to put some of that back in if you're doing a post firm dry hop. But you've layered in some more complexity with that active firm, so I think you're still going to get a more unique, different beer.
I agree completely. I you know, to the person that asked this question, Smooth Fusion, I would say, you know, I do not think that you're going to negate the addition by subtraction benefit by doing it that way. I think just like what Scott said, I think you're going to create a more dynamic beer because you're sort of layering two sort of flavor profiles, and you'll get a more interesting beer. And an interesting way to do it might be taking your dry hop that would have been 3 pounds per barrel of post firm dry hop and splitting it 1.5 in active firm and 1.5 in post firm. At that point, you're gassing off potentially a lot of the less you know, or of the more hydrophobic compounds, getting some of that benefit, creating a kind of a more dynamic layer of flavor, because the flavor in the active firm dry hop is going to be different than the post firm dry hop. And I think I would encourage that layering effect that Scott just described, because I think it really helps make a rounder and more dynamic beer. So can make yeast harvesting a challenge. That's something that, you know, every brewer has to grapple with, but I think there are ways to do that effectively. I really encourage active firm dry hopping. For those of you out there who have not tried it before, I think it makes excellent beer, and no reason to be scared of it. It definitely amplifies some of the good things in beer. One other question from Josh. Do the hop aroma maps come from oil composition, human sensory, or a combination of the two? The radar diagrams that we showed in the last few slides, those are based on human sensory. The first one that we showed was based on human sensory of raw hops, so like a raw hop analysis and a panel, examining that. And the second, the few other radar diagrams were based on sensory analysis, what's more specifically CATA, or check all that apply analysis of finished beers. So check all that apply just means that if there's citrus there, you check it, and the concentrations are based on the total percentage of panelists who checked yes on that certain compound. So it's meant to be sort of a stand-in indicator of intensity, though it has, every sensory analysis method has its shortcomings, but that's one that we really prefer for experiments like this. So. Another question that came in from Huba: has it been identified what causes these compounds to survive through the brewing process? Is it process specific, compound specific, concentration specific, a combination, or something different than all that together? I heard Scott talk about this recently on a podcast, and it was super interested in learning more. So Scott, you wanna tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what, like we were saying earlier, like yeast interaction can play a role in which compounds are surviving or which ones don't, just based off, if it's a lager strain or two different ale strains, for example. But other factors, temperature of ferment or temperature of whirlpool. I mean, that's something I'd love to see even more research into. There's really been one that, that I always point to, and I think it's the only one that's been done in terms of like, whirlpooling at 212, 185, and like 165, that you get a different retention of compounds, and you get a different retention of what compounds they are. Warmer was a little fruitier, colder was a little more herbal. And so it's, it's interesting to use some of this research and to figure out, like for the cryo blend, for example, it's really high alpha. And so if you're doing, you might want to lower your whirlpool quite a bit so you can use more of it, so you're not getting too much bitterness in with that beer, and you're still trying to retain as much of the compounds as you can. But I think for us, we like to try to, just because one hop might be high in 3MH or one hop might be, have hop-derived fatty acids that can play a role synergistically, and down the line, doesn't mean you should just use all of that one hop. That's why we kind of like to layer in whirlpool hops, especially ones that we think will have an impact with more of these survivable compounds. So I love the idea of using some of the cryo blend and some individual hops as well. Like sometimes we'll double batch a beer, so that's we're brewing twice in one day, two different high survivable hops in each whirlpool at different temperatures. So you could potentially use 4 different hops, around 2 pounds per barrel is what we're doing in a lot of these whirlpools, at 190 to 180, changing our 212 right at knockout. And because we're just trying to get as many compounds into that fermenter as possible, and layer. Because I like that complexity, and because synergy is such a big, it seems to be anyway, that synergy is such a big factor in driving a lot of these flavors in compounds. So when it comes to hop side and even mid-fermentation dry hops, I think, it's not practical for, I don't think we would use expensive Nelson or Galaxy mid-ferm if we're going to be blowing off a lot of those compounds. But if there's a good synergistic hop variety that we could sneak in mid-ferm, that's cheaper and pair it with something like a more expensive cheater type hop thing, that's another aspect too. So there's a lot of factors that play, I think, into compound retention. But for us, it's kind of a guessing game, and then taking great notes too is just a big part of it. I mean, like I said earlier, just tasting a lot of our beers pre-dry hop has been, and taking notes on those has been one of the most beneficial things to us, because you can use all the science, but you still it comes down to what you're tasting and what you're smelling. So you can use the science as sort of a guide to experimentation. But so I kind of answered his question. I think there's just a lot of variables that can play a role in survivable.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think from the experimentation that we've done so far, if I was going to offer just a few specific points of advice, I would say, you know, I'm not a chemist, but I would say a lot of what makes these compounds survive over others is just their chemical makeup and their tendency to want to be soluble and basically be able to be dissolved in wort or be dissolved in beer. So not being able to, like I said, I'm not a chemist, so I couldn't tell you specifically about what their chemical makeup is doing, but some of them are basically what we would call hydrophobic, and meaning that they don't want to be in beer, they want to get out of beer, they want to escape. And some of them are hydrophilic, meaning that they have a greater tendency to survive in beer. So I'll also say, just as a piece of advice, in general, I would say brewers that I observe in the market probably underestimate how quickly those compounds are getting into their beer, particularly in dry hop. I think oftentimes brewers are tempted to leave things on dry hops longer than necessary. We see that there are substantially diminishing returns on dry hop length of dry hop, particularly once the dry hop is either bubbled or agitated with a pump. In a lot of cases, we see anywhere 12 to 24 hours being adequate and very diminishing returns after that point. So I would say the compounds that are going to survive are going to get in there pretty quickly. You shouldn't have to work that hard. I'm talking specifically on the dry hop side here to get them in there. So, and I think the longer that your hops are on, or that your beer is on hops, the longer that you have the tendency to potentially make those things that don't want to survive as much actually get in there and stick around a little more. So I would say less is more when it comes to contact time, particularly on post-firm dry hop. And for more information on the, what makes them stick around in the chemical composition, I'd be happy to point you to our lab team, who is a bunch of very smart folks that would be happy to talk to you about carbon chains and all of the things that go along with organic chemistry. So looks like all the questions we have, and we're definitely going over on time here. So I guess any other last questions out there before we sign off?
I guess while you're waiting there to see what's in there, the quick comment on like quicker dry hop durations is one that we've almost exclusively do now. We're doing colder and shorter contact time than I think we would have been doing 3 years ago. For us, it's like 58 degrees and below is almost all of our dry hops. A couple days, a burp or two a day. And it's just, research into, some of those compounds you might not want getting in there from the longer exposure. Like polyphenols, for example, I think kind of be an astringent thing, which, hazy IPAs in particular can sometimes be way too astringent and green. And I think that's trying to back some of those compounds down in those beers by, a cooler dry hop. I think 68 versus 58 was like almost half as many polyphenols were extracted in one paper. You're getting less myrcene too at the lower temperatures. You have less chance of other problems like hop creep at the lower temperatures and shorter durations. And so I like that comment, and I think that's a good tip for. I think it's made our beer a lot better to do that, especially if you're agitating. I wouldn't be afraid to do colder dry hops.
Very well said. Looks like we got one more that came through here. Are all styles suitable for encouraging biotransformation? Let's say a non-New England IPA. The good question, Kevin. That's kind of $1 million question, I would say right now. Is we get commonly asked. Kind of another way to phrase that question is what yeasts are most effective at encouraging biotransformation versus others. That's a relatively unexplored area for us, and I think really quite unexplored for the industry. We know some ones that do it quite well. Chico, London Ale 3. Yeasts like that are kind of tried and true. I'm certain that there are many more of them out there, though, that would be very suitable for it that we just probably haven't really discovered yet. And not being a yeast lab, we have not had the chance to explore all those in detail. But I would say I think you can apply the concepts of like survivables and active from dry hopping and all these other things to many different styles that are not New England IPA. So pale ale, anything that's using a dry hop in general, you could throw in an active from dry hop for the same purposes as what we have here. In fact, I think my favorite style in the whole world might be juicy, not hazy. So like a 6% beer that's very, very hopped and uses active from dry hop a lot like a hazy would, but is a little drier and a little crisper, and that really kind of hits all the notes for me. So, Scott, do you have any comments on that, on yeast strain or like styles that are well suited for it?
Yeah, I mean, we do. So some of our beers that we'll do active firm in even like day one dry hopping is beers where we don't want like the over the top, smelling a dry hop bag type of experience, because we're in some of our, you always want to have a lineup of beers where there's a couple that are just more approachable for people, and so you can't just have 8 double IPAs, right? So when we're doing like a wheat beer or something, you can sneak in just a little bit more complexity and flavor by doing a day 1 or day 2, day 3 dry hop, where you're blowing off a lot of those compounds. I think you're getting a little more hop flavor into that beer. And so that's not a New England IPA, but it's one where we take, whether, it's actual biotransformation or it's just, the masking effect or impact of certain compounds being blown off. So we'll do it in a lot of beers that we don't want to be super hoppy, actually. And then that's, not a big addition, but something small. But in terms of yeast strains, like the biotransformation of like wine yeast is something that I'm kind of been into experimenting with. So a lot of these wine yeasts are producers of both of the enzymes, the beta-lase and beta-glucosidase, that can do a lot of this biotransformative actions. But the problem is they completely change the profile of your beer. So I'm a big fan of experimenting with yeast blends. Even using some of these wine strains as little as like 3 to 5% of a yeast pitch completely changes the profile of the beer, to the point that, if there's biotransformation happening, I might not be able to tell, because it's also creating, like phenolic fermentation characteristics from the wine yeast. And so it's very difficult to do. And I've only really had good luck with, wine strains like Vin 7 at cold temperatures with lager strains, actually, and try to keep some of those fermentation profiles down, like the actual characteristics of what the yeast can bring to a beer. We have a beer that we're just gonna can tomorrow, actually, that's like 3% Hefeweizen yeast in a hazy IPA. Completely changes the beer. There's different interactions completely going on, and so that's an area I would love to see a lot more research in, or just experimentation in, is yeast blends, and potentially trying to sneak in blends that are higher in these creators of these enzymes that we know can actually do some bioconverting, or even freeing bound flavors or bound compounds in hops. That's something I would love to see more of when you're looking at hops, is how many, so there's this much geraniol, well, how much is free and how much is bound. That would be useful for me, because if there's a lot of bound, then maybe I want to use that in the whirlpool, try to use some heat to convert some of that or release some, or using it with an active enzyme during the dry hop. So combining yeast strains is fun, because the potential for unique and interesting beers is almost endless, and you can incorporate different hops into the beer based off the yeast, and using them at different times is really kind of like next level game planning when it comes to brewing beer. But I think you can get some fun results, but unfortunately, as I've learned, you can get a lot of bad results too, so I keep those on the 5-gallon system.
That is fascinating. It's safe to say we're not producing beer like we used to. I can say I can't wait to take a trip to Maryland to taste some of your beers, because blended yeast and things, all the stuff that you're describing sounds absolutely fascinating. So I think we've probably expired our time limit here, Scott. I really appreciate you coming on. I think I enjoyed it, the heck out of it, and I hope everybody else did too. Thank you, everybody who attended. And once again, to learn more about this, you can visit our webinars online, and also please if you're interested in these concepts, buy Scott's book, The New IPA, incredible book, which really dives deep into a lot of these concepts and can make you a better brewer. So thank you again, Scott.
Yeah, thank you again for having me on and for doing this research and also sharing it. I think that's what I appreciate the most. Is a lot of times there's a lot of stuff like this happening that we brewers just don't see or know, and so it's great that you're, like I said, both doing it and sharing it with us and letting brewers kind of be a voice to help guide future experimentation. I think that's a great thing.
I appreciate that. I'm still a brewer at heart, so that's always my my headspace. So anyway, yeah, making better beer because I like to drink better beer. So
yeah, exactly.
Anyway. All right, we'll pass it back over to you, Nicole.
All right. Well, before I let everyone go, I just wanted to again extend a huge thank you to both of you for your presenting. It was great information. And just a reminder to everyone, this session was recorded. It will be up on the website soon. And I also uploaded the presentation slides to both virtualharvest.com and to the Whova app, so you can go ahead and download those at your leisure. And also just a reminder, if you have questions at all on this session or any sessions that you do watch, feel free to email brewschool@yakimachief.com and we will forward those on to the appropriate departments or people. And then just again, thank you all so much for joining us today on this live session at Virtual Harvest. And we hope to see you on the next session. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.